Okay, let me call to order a meeting of the Colorado State Board of Land Commissioners. Today is Wednesday, September 9th, 2020. The meeting is being conducted via Zoom web conferencing, and we have all 5 commissioners present and accounted for this afternoon. Our first item of business, open public comment period for non-agenda items. If you are an attendee and you wish to make a comment for a non-agenda item, this would be the time, and you can raise your hand. I do see Miss Hodges has her hand up. Nick, if you'd bring her forth.
Do the promotion.
Yeah.
Ms. Hodges has the ability to comment.
Hi, I raised my hand multiple times during the Chico presentation, but wasn't called on. May I just speak a moment on Chico?
Sure.
Thank you. First of all, I'm really impressed with the amount of time you've spent on this. I know I've been paying attention for over a year, and the detail you've gone into is very impressive, and I especially thank Commissioners Heath and Scanlon for their interest in the natural values and protecting it perhaps as a whole. I wanted to clear something up that I think may have been miscommunicated to you, or I don't know what you're hearing from other organizations. But Aiken Audubon and the Audubon chapter's assertions are not that it can't be managed as 3 entities, or that there isn't sound stewardship. The issue is in the division itself. And yes, we realize that Frost and Hannah and Bohart ranches are extremely well run, and I'm familiar with all those folks and regard them highly. It's the process of the division, the potential roads, infrastructure, corral, fences, buildings, anything that would go in that might fragment the habitat. And to what degree would it hurt? That I can't tell you, but you should have heard from, or at least I have been told from both Colorado Natural Heritage Program and the Nature Conservancy that, the best scientific conservation outcome is to keep it whole. So that said, I did also want to say I found it interesting at last month's meeting that and I think it was presented this month, the financial outcomes that were proposed for the years 2024 to 34, that when they were presented, it was said by staff that there is not much difference in the overall revenue that would be received with 1 lessee or 3 lessees. So that said, I feel that you could achieve a great balance between revenue and conservation, which I think is what many want. It sounds like by keeping it as 1 parcel with 1 lessee, which again is the optimal situation according to many people that you use for your own research. I wonder also, since you mentioned the interest in bringing up young ranchers, which is a very laudable topic, that I wonder how that might be managed if it were broken up into 3 parcels. I'm certainly no expert, but that came up for me. Again, you've lauded the Phillips family, as do birders. They have been excellent land stewards. They have had, as the other folks you've mentioned, have had many accolades and awards. They have been very welcoming, wonderful partners with Aiken Audubon and other birders, and have called on us when they needed extra hands for something that may have occurred at the ranch, and we have willingly gone out to help in whatever way we could. I also wanted to say that the birders that I know, of which there are many, very clearly understand that Chico Basin is the exception to having access, and not that state lands in general have willy-nilly access. We go out to Brett Gray regularly and other properties and understand the uniqueness of Chico. And I wonder, you know, of course, we're interested in the K through 12 educational opportunities out there and the bird banding, and feel that getting those kids out there is sort of their first exposure to a ranch, oftentimes, and to the ranching way, and to stewardship, and to general caring for the land. So that's important to us. And also, I would add that if financial concerns are an issue regarding, say, banding, you know, I'd be happy to look for outside funding, and I think there would be outside funding. And whether that would deal with you all or the lessee, I'm not sure. But I think, you know, we could perhaps find, you know, collaborative ways to make things happen. I think, let me just take a quick look. And of course, we're interested in access. Of course we are, as birders. It's a wonderful property. And let me just say, the concern for the land, the flora and the fauna is foremost, and our personal access is down the line. That's all for now. I look forward to talking to you next month. And again, thank you so much for your concern.
Thank you. Anyone have a question or anything for Ms. Hodges before we say goodbye? Okay. Thank you, Ms. Hodges. I appreciate your comments. Okay, I don't see any other hands up amongst our, there's Duke Phillips. Nick, would you like to bring him back?
I'm working on it.
Welcome back, Duke.
All right, thank you. Just a couple things. I think there's an oversight looking back at the responses for the original RFP. There were 3 finalists picked from a group that was larger, and I don't know what the exact number was, but I think it was 15 or 20. And the other aspect is that when we meet to talk about the lease rate, it's not a negotiation. This is a special lease, and we have always used the rates that the State Land Board representative brings, which is a standard rate. And we have never said no. We go with what that is. So it's not a negotiated thing where we're trying to outbid each other. It's basically an established rate. I would also like to point out that one of the things that I've heard is that the putting it out to a public bid is going to establish the true value. It's the only way you can understand really what people are willing to give. But I would contend that the value is already determined. It's going to be between 20 and the highest is going to be whatever that was, $48, which it probably won't be. So I would say that you already have a very strong indicator based on the rates that you have been bidded on ranches, and you also have the private sector, so you can come very, very close to what a market rate is, and then take into account any of the other kinds of special uses that that might be negotiated into that rate. So I don't think you need a competitive bid. I think that information is already at hand. And I think one of the other one of the other things that I've heard is that there's pressure from the public, from ranchers, to do this or do that. And I think that either way, say if Box T wins, if it goes out to competitive bid and Box T wins, you're going to be under a lot of criticism if you go that way as well. So I don't think there's going to be any way of getting away from criticism. And I think one of the really important things that need to be considered is in terms of keeping ranch intact as a whole. Not only is it fact that the larger the block of land, the less there is in terms of infrastructure, fences that may not be built, in the next years, but if there's a precedent set for 3 ranches versus 1 ranch over time, which, could be 15, 20, 30 years, there will be structures and infrastructure that's built. So you'd be setting precedents for that into the future, which will impact a very, very cool place now. And secondly, I can emphasize that many of the things that we've done from a stewardship standpoint, such as restoration of the creek, building fences, putting water points in so we could rest more land. These are all initiatives that we took, were never expected or even state land board never directed us to do. All things that we went out and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. We were able to do that because of economy of scale. And so again, I think it's important to keep this together as one piece. The other important thing that I'd like for you to know is that the 118 rights that are given to some, we won those at the beginning because we understood that if we exceeded expectations, we would have the right to sit down and negotiate. And so we took our chances, thinking that we will be able to exceed expectations and therefore be able to sit down and talk with you about how we may continue working together in the future. And so that was the reason we waived at the beginning when we first sat down to talk. And then secondly, when Beverly Rave and John Valentine proposed that we do that again, we waived time. So thank you very much for your time, and appreciate everything you guys are doing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Duke. Any questions for Duke before we move on? All right, appreciate your time, Duke.
Right, see you guys.
Bye. Okay, next item, announcements.
Commissioner, I don't have any here.
Okay.
Other commissioners?
Right, seeing none. Department of Natural Resources report. It looks like we have Ms. Mazal here with us.
Hi,
Welcome.
thank you, Commissioner Butterworth. Thanks, everybody. I am here for Doug Vilsack again. It's great to see you on a snowy September night. And just for the record, Vanessa Mazal, I'm a policy advisor with the Department of Natural Resources. As I've done in the last few times I've updated you, I'll start with an update on the state's COVID scenario. As we kind of go into this season, we remain at the safer at home or in the great vast outdoors, or maybe it's the vast great outdoors level, which still requires face coverings and social distancing, but also encourages people to visit the vast outdoors. As of yesterday, the state had just under 60,000 total confirmed cases since the start of the COVID outbreak, and that was out of 753,000 roughly tests conducted. And we were at about just under 2,000 deaths. I think it's 1,868 deaths that are attributed to the disease. And then the 2-week, good news for us, I think, is that the 2-week average incidence rate has been declining or has plateaued across most of the state. And somewhat not surprisingly, where I am in Boulder County and in Broomfield and Weld counties, which are all affected by the start of the university, that we've seen an uptick in those counties. So that's a bit unfortunate. And I think CU stood at 133 cases since the start of school a couple weeks ago. I thought it's just worth mentioning, because I think that it's been a topic of conversation, that our wildfire scenario, even in light of the 14 inches that some parts of the Front Range received of snow overnight, it still remains pretty dire. And the Cameron Peak Fire, we spoke with the Forest Service yesterday evening, and it remains at 4% containment. This should allow them to get to some of the real hot spots, but there still remains a real risk to water supply, certainly to the broader landscape. It was at over 100,000 acres as of last night. I don't know if any of you heard, but an interesting point of fact that our intrepid executive director, Dan Gibbs, was on fire detail earlier this month on the Grizzly Gulch fire in Glenwood Canyon, which was, I think it was roughly around 90% containment as of yesterday. So I haven't checked on that one today, but it was just in his spare time, he volunteers as a wildland firefighter. A couple of other points of interest. I think it probably goes without saying that we're still kind of paying close attention to the budget outlook over the next couple of years. It remains very challenging and uncertain. DNR is very much affected by the same factors and phenomena that the State Land Board is affected by. We're certainly concerned about the drop in oil and gas revenue. We are awaiting word on further federal recovery finances, and we're just kind of paying attention to what the federal stimulus funds are going to look like. That'll matter a lot for us, and we're very concerned just overall about the state general fund revenues. So we don't have a lot to report right now, but that's kind of where we are. I think that's what we're looking around the corner for. The DNR is working currently right now with the governor's office to develop our legislative priorities for the upcoming session. Not much to report right now, but we're certainly looking at a variety of options. As you can imagine, there's a lot of interest right now in legislative proposals. So I think it's going to be a pretty busy session. And there's a variety of things that we're looking at in regards to permanent funding for Colorado Parks and Wildlife and a variety of other things. But I think we'll have more information next meeting to be able to kind of point you or have a sense of what we're going to be pointing toward in the upcoming session.
Did you say permanent funding for CPW?
Sustainable funding for CPW. That's one of the WIGs I think I updated you guys on last time, but maybe just to remind you, that's one of our wildly important goals for DNR, which is to identify a more sustainable funding sources for CPW. Yeah. In addition to a couple of other WIGs. I can certainly go over those again, Commissioner Butterworth, if that would be helpful.
No, that's good.
Okay.
Parks and Wildlife needs it.
They need it, that's for sure. It would certainly be a load off, wouldn't it? So a couple other things that are of interest. The governor signed, it's been maybe 2 weeks, an executive order affirming the state's commitment to diversity and inclusion and producing an equitable workforce. So that's a pretty interesting direction. It aligns very closely with DNR's own internal wildly important goal, or WIG, related to EDI, or those three, the acronym for those, equitability, diversity, and inclusivity. We have our own internal WIG, but we are really expanding that initiative. It started last year. We kind of launched this initiative last year to really be focused on our hiring practices. And we're really expanding that to look at more how do we tackle these values and the work that we do and in how we do our work. So, and also how do we retain staff and really create a culture of inclusivity within DNR. It's going to be a really interesting initiative. I'm involved in it. DNR's human resources team is leading the charge, and certainly for those that are interested, invite you to touch down on that. It'll be interesting to see how it takes shape. Also of interest for this team, the COGCC rulemakings addressing their Senate Bill 19181 are pressing ahead, and currently they are wrapping up rulemakings on their 200 to 600 series, dealing with alternative facility location analysis and cumulative impacts. We understand, although it's not given notice, but we understand that the 800 series, in particular dealing with wildlife, is going to be up later this month. So we'll stay tuned for that. That's something obviously CPW and DNR have been very heavily involved in. And let's see, a couple of other final kind of just mentions. I wanted to just note for those who are interested that the state attorney general joined a multi-state lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's final revisions to their NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act regulations. And just as part of that, federal agencies have also been revising their own internal regulations regarding NEPA implementation. And DNR is leading a state effort right now to comment on the Forest Service's proposed revisions to their oil and gas categorical exclusion regulations, which is a pretty interesting attempt, I suppose, to sort of actually take the forest, deregulate, or maybe loosen the Forest Service's role in shaping oil and gas decisions on Forest Service land. They're really shifting that to kind of a single point of decision within the Department of Interior. Two other items for those who are interested as well, given that sage grouse are on the agenda, we're anxiously awaiting the Fish and Wildlife Service's release of the final species recovery plan for Gunnison sage grouse, hopefully on October 1, which certainly has implications for state land board properties and other land use and management on the western slope in the southwestern part of the state. So stay tuned for that. I'm not sure what it will entail, but there's certainly a lot of interest in what that's going to look like. And then finally, we've been really appreciative of the staff's engagement and help in assisting us with producing policy recommendations as a deliverable under the governor's executive order dealing with big game habitat and migration corridors that was issued last year. We are delayed. We had COVID-related delays in submitting this report that was initially due in July, but we're really paying close attention to that and probably waiting to release it until after the COGCC rulemaking wraps up, so that we can address, kind of look ahead and incorporate what those regulations are going to entail. And I'm certainly available to answer questions if you have any. Otherwise, I'll stand by and hang out for the rest of the day.
Any questions for Vanessa? Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate the updates.
Thank you.
All right. Now we're on to final action items. 1A, Arista non-simultaneous exchange, tab 6, and Julie Majors.
Good afternoon, commissioners, and welcome to those who are listening, and thank you so much for your patience. I will share my screen here momentarily, and we'll put this one up. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So I'm happy to be with you guys this afternoon to walk us through the non-simultaneous exchange for the Arista parcel. We actually think that there will be two benefits, two outcomes from this presentation if the board agrees with staff's recommendation. One is we will be able to take a non-income producing asset and turn it into an income producing asset after we reinvest the proceeds. And then also we have the opportunity to accomplish some affordable housing goals, which we think will not only benefit the community, but also Broomfield, the city of Broomfield, and as well help accomplish some of the current administration goals for affordable housing. So again, stuck here, there we go. All right, the property is located in Broomfield County. It's 6.2 acres. Just for context, the property found itself located within a master plan mixed-use urban renewal center in the city of Broomfield. This development is called the Arista, and it's being developed by Weens Capital, Tim Weens. Property sits right here, right off of Wadsworth Boulevard. And as you can see, US 36 is over here, north again to Boulder and south to Denver. It is located within the master plan community that the First Bank Event Center is in. The vision for the build out for the master plan is for commercial, which you see in blue, retail, which you see in red, and then yellow is residential. So you can see that the developer has drawn in the board site as a multifamily residential community. The vision has not quite been accomplished yet by the developer, but we know that there's a lot of updates that are going on, lots of activity out in the area. We have a lot of retail going to the north of us. We've got another multifamily site going in to the south of us. Parks and open space are being developed, and there's a lot of activity happening on the west side of Wadsworth. And just again, for context, the regional airport is right here. So a lot of exciting things happening in the development area right now, and we did believe that it was time to take this property out to the market to see what that would look like. So in February, the board agreed with staff that we would go to the market and do a request for proposals, an RFP. The objective was to monetize the property, and we used $15 per square foot as our basis, which was backed up by an appraisal. We wanted to be able to close the transaction in a relatively quick time if it was a development, somewhere between 18 and 24 months. We did not want to have to participate or bring any additional capital to the project. And as an added benefit, we wanted to see if a developer could achieve a minimum of 100 affordable housing units. So the results, in July, we received 4 qualified bids. All of the bids were for acquisition of the parcel. We were very pleased, and if any of the developers who submitted are listening, again, we want to reiterate that the proposals were very well received, very professionally done, and again, we want to thank those developers for submitting those proposals. They were all very professionally submitted. So we could only pick one, and staff's recommendation out of the 4 that were submitted is that we go with Gorman and Company. Gorman and Company, we felt, hit all of the goals that the board was looking for in the RFP. They are a very established multifamily affordable housing company here in Denver with a lot of projects under their belt. And we just felt like we were the most confident moving forward with them. And again, they really helped the board achieve everything that that we had on in the RFP. If the board agrees to do this, we don't believe that this will have a fiscal impact to the local school district or the state education fund. And if we do this, we will be able to satisfy a 2008 memorandum of agreement that has been out there with the developer, who has worked to install infrastructure to the site and has entitled the property such that the board is now the beneficiary of all that work. So with that, I'm going to submit the final recommendation that the board accept the Gorman and Company bid for the 6.2 acre site in Broomfield for the amount that we did discuss in executive session. And I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Julie. Commissioners, Commissioner Heath?
Yes, thank you, Julie. Julie, how many units of affordable housing are they projecting?
So Gorman and Company has presented 155 units, and one of the nice things about their bid was that they were doing 100%. They are proposing 100% of their units to be affordable, and they're going to attempt to achieve a overall 60% AMI on the entire project for the 155 units.
And I understand that, you know, part of this is dependency on the CHAFA tax credits. What happens if those credits don't come through?
So that was one of our concerns, and you know, with the history that we've had on a couple of other projects, working with the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, you know, there's always a chance to do another round. We would have to wait. I think it's 6 months. It depends on what, whether you're going for 4% or 9% credits. But we would have to wait another round and probably give Gorman and Company the opportunity to try to achieve those tax credits again. But there was one of the reasons why we felt confident with Gorman and Company, because they have a 100% success rate with CHAFA.
Commissioner Heath, perhaps answered slightly differently. The closing is conditioned upon the award of tax credits. And so you may have been asking the question, how do we know that what we want to have happen will actually happen? And so I think the answer is that they won't close until they get the tax credits. So we know that the land use restrictions that come with the credits will be in place and ensure that the affordable housing we want to have happen there will occur. Is that what you're asking?
That's very helpful. And let me ask you this, as if the credits did not come through, do we reopen the bidding process or what happens?
Could certainly take the property back out to market. Yeah. Gorman's a pretty persistent group. Somewhere I suspect their principal is on our call smiling, but they've got a pretty good track record of being able to get those. They've built, Christine, Commissioner Scanlon, I know they've got a project going up in your neighborhood. They've done them up in Vail. They've done a variety of them here in Denver. They're very familiar with the CHAF process and what the important aspects are in that competitive bid process to get them. So they'd probably resubmit. And if they've decided they didn't want to do that further, we can go back out to market at that time.
Okay, thank you. Both questions were helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think, you know, having reviewed the bids, you know, there, what stood out for Gorman is I mean, all the points that you've really emphasized, Julie, is the familiarity and success with qualifying for the tax credits with CHAFA, locally based, and you know, the fact that the intent is 155 affordable housing units. You know, I marvel, you know, I toured the property several years ago. I don't think we had that in our sights. You know, we were wondering what we would be doing with it. And just sort of a credit to the agency, and I think Bill's leadership, you know, with Governor Polis and his vision of increasing affordable housing in our state. You know, one of the first charges, actually, when Commissioner Heath and Commissioner Scanlon joined, was doing an inventory of opportunities, of assets that we had, and seeing if we could find a way to help increase the inventory. So very comfortable with the recommendation of the staff on this parcel.
This is Commissioner Shaw. I also would want to add that the city and county of Broomfield, this is something that they are very favorable toward, and that helps to eliminate one more of the hurdles.
Thank you. Okay, seeing no questions or comments from other commissioners, I would ask our attendees, if you wish to make comment on this item, I invite you to do so. Raise your virtual hand and we can bring you forward.
And Commissioner, you may be seeing it. Duke in there in the list is just a glitch. He's not even on this machine anymore.
No, I assumed that. Although he might want to still comment, I don't know. Okay, seeing no public comment, I would entertain a motion.
This is Commissioner Carney. I move to approve the non-simultaneous exchange of the 6.2 acres in the Arista parcel as presented in the board packet.
Great, thank you. It was moved by Commissioner Carney, second by Commissioner Heath. Any further discussion? All right, I'll take a roll call vote. If in favor, indicate by saying aye. Commissioner Shaw?
Aye.
Commissioner Heath?
Aye.
Commissioner Carney?
Aye.
Commissioner Scanlon?
Aye.
And I vote in favor. A motion passes 5-0. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. And Gary, I did want to chime in. This was a better outcome than I perhaps ever hoped for. And it is a credit to Bill and the team. So thank you.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thank you so much, commissioners.
Yep. On to final action item 1B, Schriever Air Force Base, non-simultaneous exchange, tab 7, Christopher Smith.
Great. Good morning or good afternoon, commissioners. Can everybody see my screen all right?
Yep.
Okay. I'm Christopher Smith. I'm the real estate section manager here at the State Land Board, and I'm here today to recommend that the board approve a non-simultaneous exchange of 640 acres and a 99-year mineral non-development agreement on 3680 acres directly to the federal government for assets held within Schriever Air Force Base. Transferring this land will eliminate a board liability and is a step towards the state's effort to secure getting Space Command permanently located in Colorado. So Schriever Air Force Base is located in central El Paso County, approximately 10 miles east of Colorado Springs. The black border you see in the middle of your screen here is the boundary of the base, and the blue square in the middle of the base is state trust land, which is the secure part of the base where most of the buildings are located. In addition, the board owns almost all of the minerals under the base, which are shown here in the yellow crosshatch. So the board manages land adjacent to several military installations in Colorado. Last November, base commanders from 5 of these bases spoke to the board about their mission and highlighted concerns with certain uses on state lands adjacent to the installations. In March of this year, the board visited Schriever Air Force Base. This agenda item is specific to the issues inside the Schriever Air Force Base boundaries. The majority of the buildings on this base are located on state trust land pursuant to a perpetual right-of-way. Should the Air Force ever cease to use the base, these specialized buildings would be functionally obsolete and will become board property. We believe the cost to remove them would exceed the value of the land. Last month, the Air Force submitted a letter requesting that the board transfer title to the 640-acre state trust land surface estate and requested that the board voluntarily delay the leasing and development of any state-owned mineral estate inside the base boundary until the base ceases to be used. Because of the right-of-way, ownership of the surface has significant liabilities. Staff believes the interests of the school trust are best protected by transferring title to the encumbered surface estate to the military in return for funds already paid and the release from future liabilities associated with the remediation and restoration of this property. Staff also evaluated the mineral potential of the hydrocarbon and solid mineral estate. There is currently no interest in oil and gas development in this area. The minerals are at the western edge of the DJ Basin, and the area is considered exploratory in nature. And although the geology suggests that oil and gas may be present, wells drilled as recently as 2013 resulted in dry wells. While the solid mineral geology suggests a high prospectivity for limestone, sand, and gravel, the intricacies of permitting mineral extraction on severed estate under this highly sensitive and secured military base significantly decreases the likelihood that an operator will get a permit. As a result, staff recommends the board issue a mineral non-development agreement on the state-owned minerals inside the boundaries of the base for the shorter of 99 years or until the base is gone. Staff believes that the minerals may have value once again once the base is gone. All these values associated with the fee surface estate as encumbered and the non-development agreement were presented to the board in executive session. Because there will be no change of the use of this property, staff believes that there is no negative fiscal impact. Therefore, staff recommends the board approve the disposal of the fee interest in 640 acres and issue a mineral non-development agreement on 3680 acres for the shorter of 99 years or until the base is gone. Both of these are within the boundaries of Schriever Air Force Base in El Paso County, and staff is recommending a direct transaction to the U.S. Department of Defense in return for funds already received. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'd also like to say that Keith Klain with the Defense Mission Task Force is on the line, and he would like the opportunity to speak to the board as well.
Okay, before we get to him, Commissioners, any questions for Christopher? Okay, seeing none. Mr. Klain, good to see you.
Good to see you, Commissioner Butterworth. Thank you so much for giving us a few minutes today and for taking this up. We've been working on it, as you know, about a year. We're so glad to see this come before you for consideration today. Many thanks to Director Ryan and Greg Okish and Chris Smith and even Justin Osborne for all the work that's gone into this project over the course of the last year. And I know we've got other projects still ongoing, but this is a big deal for Colorado. It's getting the highest visibility at the Department of Defense and the Air Force. In fact, I'll be delivering some information on it to the Pentagon personally in about 2 weeks. So very important stuff. We appreciate it very much, all of your diligence. We particularly appreciate all the commissioners and staff who took the time to come out and visit us in March, not only this site, but also the Bullseye site just down the road. So we're very grateful for those things, very grateful for your considerations today. I'll stand by if there are any questions that, that need to be answered from our end. Thank you.
We got that visit in just in time. I think it was
we did, didn't we?
A week before it seems like the world changed forever. So
that is so true, but thanks again.
Sure. Any questions for Keith? Mr. Klain, sorry. All right, seeing none, I would entertain a motion.
This is Commissioner Scanlon. After consideration of the materials presented, the commission determines it's in the best interest of the trust to approve the non-simultaneous exchange of acreage as presented for Schriever Air Force Base in El Paso County.
It's moved by Commissioner Scanlon, seconded by Commissioner Carney. Any further discussion? All right, I'll take a roll call vote. If in favor, indicate by saying aye. Commissioner Heath?
Aye.
Commissioner Scanlon?
Aye.
Commissioner Shaw?
Aye.
And Commissioner Carney?
Aye.
And I vote in favor. Motion passes 5-0. Mr. Klain, before you leave, any updates on, I know there were other parcels in and around I assume work continues on some solutions.
Yes, sir. And I'm sure Chris Smith and Greg Okish could probably speak more broadly to that than I, but to the last I knew, the ball was in the court of the Air Force base in terms of getting a survey established for the area around Bullseye. And to my knowledge, that's where that still stands. They've reached out to the Corps of Army Engineers to assist with that effort, but they're still fully engaged, still working to get that done with you folks. Hopefully we'll hear something on how to best get that survey done in short order.
Okay, great.
I'll bring that subject up in Washington as well in a couple of weeks. So we'll see where that leads.
Okay. Greg, did you have something?
I was just going to say, Keith is correct. The short-term solution to get the right-of-way expanded for the airstrip is underway, and then longer term, I understand the Palmer Land Trust is probably going to look at ways to protect some of the land. Remember the south side of Schriever outside the fence? There were concerns around that. Palmer Land Trust, I think, is going to look at that. And then on Bohart, we're still exploring the long-term possibility of protecting that with the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Lands, which would protect all of those aerial flight training areas.
Yeah.
So,
great. Good. All right. Thank you, Keith. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
All right. We got a double dip with Ms. Gottsagen here. Item 1C, the Fen Stewardship Action Plan, tab 8. Welcome, Mindy.
Welcome, thank you. Good afternoon, commissioners. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. I want to take your time today to present 2 stewardship action plans for your consideration. One is the Fen Stewardship Action Plan, and the second will be the Greater Sage-Grouse one. You may recall that stewardship action plans are one of our 7 stewardship tools that are used to address a threatened resource or ecosystem across a series of properties. And I'll start today with the Fen Stewardship Action Plan. I'd like to take a look at responsible stewardship of a 20,000-year-old resource. Fens date back to the end of the Ice Age in Colorado, and so as such are kind of glacial relics of that period of time, and they persisted since that time. The fens on state trust land are located along the central spine of the Southern Rockies Mountains within the state of Colorado. They exist between 8,500 and 11,000 feet, and so we don't have a tremendous amount of state trust land within that ecosystem, but within Colorado, we have most of the fens on state trust lands are located in the South Park area of Park County, and we do have one that we've discovered in Jackson County. Should additional fen sites become, should we become aware of them, that they would be subject to this Fen Stewardship Action Plan. Most of the focus of the Fen Stewardship Action Plan is going to be on these 9 or so properties located in South Park. This is where most of our fens are located, and these are a rare and unusual kind of fen because of the specific kind of groundwater high in calcium that flows from the Mosquito Range to the west. And so these are the properties that we are aware of that fens are located on at this time. All but one of them are in the Stewardship Trust, and 2 of them are also Colorado natural areas. So what are fens? They're kind of wetland, but they're a very rare and unusual kind of wetland. Unlike most wetlands where the water that exists on them comes from off-site or falls through rain, fens are actually supported solely by groundwater. So there's a permanent source of groundwater coming up from beneath them. And as such, they're different from bogs, which the water doesn't drain from. Another distinguishing characteristic of fens are these floating peat mats. Because of that constant source of groundwater coming up from beneath, these areas are perennially saturated with water. And as such, unique plants and animal species have evolved to exist within that environment.
Andy, do they freeze in the winter?
No, they don't freeze in the winter. And even in drought conditions, you'll go out there and they'll still continue to be wet. So, so why are fens important? One, they're a unique peatland, and the peat that forms there in those perpetually saturated conditions take thousands of years to form. And in fact, just to form 1 inch to 3 inches of peat can take 1,000 years. I mentioned that the fens that we're aware of in South Park are extreme rich fens. This particular kind of fen is even rare within the state of Colorado. And as such, this high calcium water has created these rich islands of biodiversity that support rare plants and animals. Most of those are invertebrates, they're waterborne animals, or animals that depend on that ecosystem. Some of these plants exist nowhere else in Colorado and nowhere else in the world. They're important groundwater discharge sites that release a steady source of water to the surrounding ecosystem. They're also a sign of a shallow groundwater system. And very importantly, because of the peat, they help store carbon and help regulate the amount of carbon that's released into the atmosphere. Disturbance of fen sites actually release carbon, and so their protection is also another way to help prevent climate change. And finally, there are these iconic scenic components of our mountain landscapes. I want to give a little bit of background on some of the lease acreages. This is a fen, well, this is a stewardship action plan that's very small. It only addresses about 20,000 acres or 21,000 acres. And the fen sites on those are actually a fraction of that. I put an asterisk on this fen acreage of nearly 1,600 acres. That's because we're currently mapping the precise boundaries of the fens. And actually, I'm guessing that the actual fen acreage will be closer to about 600 acres. The fens are located on grazing leases, only that total about 9. Some grazing leases have more than 1 fen and some have only 1. There are currently 14,000 acres or so in the public access program. Again, this is largely in Park County. And there are about 2,800 acres that are leased for private recreation use. There are currently no mineral subsurface leases, only 1 oil and gas lease that's underneath a fen, and 0 renewable energy leases that involve fens at this time. I want to talk a little bit about what the historic impacts have been. I've mentioned that these fens have been around for 20,000 years and more, but most of the impacts to them that we're aware of have come just in the last 150. The first of those has been ditching and draining. When this area was settled 150 to 200 years ago, one of the first things was common practice, it still is in many ways, is to ditch and drain wetlands. The idea is let's get the water out of there so we can use it for other purposes. So this removes the water quickly from a site. And then those lands that were then drained were used for hay fields. This is a picture of our Salt Creek West fen. It's in the Stewardship Trust, and this is the remnant of an exclosure area where baled hay used to be kept. This is no longer being used for haying, but you can see the remnants of the sites that were there when that practice was being done. Another thing that affected the fens is the sale of water rights. In the mid-19th century, a lot of water rights were purchased, kind of a buy and dry situation within South Park, and so water was removed from the surrounding areas. This is a picture of Antero Reservoir. This year, it's a little low this year, but again, the water was removed from the surrounding areas and stored in reservoirs to be used and transported to the Front Range and other metropolitan areas. And then we've asked our fens to be the primary and in some cases the only source of water for livestock that are grazed on the properties. Because it's a perennial source of water, it's great to have, and yet the impact of animals going into these fen sites 3 to 4 times a day for their only water source has really created an impact. There's been a lot of hoof shearing and trampling on some of these fragile fen sites. These sites can recover, but it's going to take a long time. And so the focus of addressing grazing impacts will be one of the features of this fen stewardship action plan. I just want to mention too that we have that these are very complex systems. In many cases, even though fens are supported by groundwater springs or sources and create these floating mats, it's not uncommon to have other wetlands or other rivers or creeks flowing through these same sites. And so the fact that we're mapping these fens is going to be very important to their protection. This is a picture of our 4 Mile Creek at Pert site. The board visited this site about 3 or 4 years ago and stood on a hill overlooking the site. This is in the Stewardship Trust, and it's a Colorado designated natural area. This is an example of a fen that's located outside of Breckenridge, Colorado. And you can see, I wanted to show this to you to give an example of how complex these sites are. The fen springs are actually these series of stars that appear. So they're very small areas, and yet that water can flow into other areas that are perpetually saturated. And so that's one thing that we're doing now is mapping these so that when we work with our grazing lessees and recreational lessees, we'll know exactly what areas need to be protected, because there are just other traditional wetlands out there as well. So the Fen Stewardship Action Plan, there are 3 primary goals. The first of those is resource conservation, or conservation of the fens themselves. Resource development, that is how we're going to lease, continue to lease for our other lines of business while protecting the fens. And finally, how are we going to do outreach both with our lessees and other stakeholders? The first of these is our resource or fen conservation. As I mentioned, we're currently mapping the fen sites so we know exactly which areas need to be protected. And then we want to restore the ecological integrity of fens and the associated wetlands. And we'll be doing that by creating plans and then also monitoring changes and implementing adaptive management as we learn what works and what doesn't. Second, with resource or lease development, we're going to look to improve grazing management of the sites, improve recreation management. I will point out that, that some of the impacts are caused by large elk herds that use these areas in the winter. And their encounters with fencing that are used to manage livestock can also be like a problem for some of these site areas. We want to prevent negative impacts of new leases, specifically oil and gas, renewable energy, and solid minerals and rights of way. And then look at how are we going to dedicate financial resources to achieve those goals. The third component is outreach and partnering. We've already begun to work to improve lessee understanding of the ecological importance of the fens. We want to collaborate with our lessees on fen enhancement plans, which will include components of grazing management, recreation, whether the site, there's transportation roads near them. So we'll be working with them to prepare those plans starting this year. And then we want to collaborate with experts and stakeholders. We've already reached out to several other organizations such as Colorado Parks and Wildlife, CSU, Colorado Natural Heritage Program, to have them sit on a ad hoc advisory committee that might meet once a year to give us guidance on how to restore these fens and manage them. And finally, we want to document and share our learning outcomes. With leasing stipulations for resource development, well, we'll be looking at protecting groundwater, avoiding any disturbance to the fen sites, and applying buffers around them to further protect those sites. And then our third goal is lessee land board or lessee collaboration. This is our district manager, Justin Osborne, out with Josh Tashiro and natural resource conservation staff, looking at how they can help to better manage grazing on that site. The staff conducted a public meeting about 3 weeks ago to get lessee comments. We didn't have any lessees attend. We only have 9, but I did reach out to them all individually and was able to speak to some of them about their concerns. We'll continue to do assessment of state trust lands and monitor improvement of the fens over time. And finally, collaborate with the fen to collaborate with our lessees on the fen enhancement plans. Staff will be following adaptive management, meaning we'll be learning as we go and make appropriate changes. We plan to give an annual report to the board on the stewardship action plans, and that will include our progress on grazing management, on leasing activity, which leases, if any, were approved with stipulations, or whether any leases were withheld from leasing. We'll give a report on what we believe the financial impact to the agency's revenue is as a result of the Fed Stewardship Action Plan and any adaptive management recommendations. So with that, the staff recommendation is that the board approve the Fenn Stewardship Action Plan for a period of 5 years. Direct staff to review the results of implementing the plan with you each year, and consider a decision to continue or cease efforts under the plan in 2025. Are there any questions or comments?
Thank you, Mindy.
Sure.
Commissioners? How did this come to our attention? Like 20,000 years and we're now acknowledging that we have them. I'm not pinning this, but how did we understand this? And
well, the fact that these properties are all in the stewardship trust, and 2 of them are in the Colorado natural areas, there was a concern realizing that these impacts were really destroying the Fenn themselves. And so we began to take a look at it. This Fenn Stewardship Action Plan is not one that we're stepping on up with alignment with other agencies. Within the state, the agency that's probably taking the lead on protection of Fenns is probably the U.S. Forest Service. Because of the number of mountain properties that they own, they probably have several hundred Fenns within the state of Colorado. Okay. So we've actually looked to them to develop some of their protocols, to adopt some of the protocols they have for how do we assess the condition of Fenns and how do we manage them.
Okay. Commissioner Carney, yeah.
Mindy, thanks. I just had a question on the, how you said some of the Fenns are the sole water source for some of these ag lessees, and have we done any outreach or anything that how we could help with maybe helping with some wells or developing other water sources if we take these away from them?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have begun that process. We did install 1 livestock tank near a Fenn in South Park, and we expect that the provision of alternative water sources is probably going to be the primary thing that we can do to protect the Fenns. At this point, the cattle have no alternative but to go into those Fenn sites a couple of times a day. And so that's going to, so working with them to either put that kind of infrastructure in or temporary fencing to change up the seasonality of when the grazing occurs, that's going to be the primary focus of this stewardship action plan.
Okay. Commissioner Heath?
Right. I had the same question of Tyler, but 2 other things. Mindy, first, I thought this was a very thorough report, and I, for one, have learned a lot. I didn't realize that they were so rare. And secondly, I thought the video, and high marks to you and to Kristen, the video on the website that you've done is really well done. So congratulations on that as well.
Thank you.
Nick, I see Justin Osborne has his hand up. Can you bring him forward?
You guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, Commissioner Carney, just to kind of elaborate on what Mindy had said, we have drilled 1 well related to one of the properties that has Fenns on them. We've got a tire tank in there. We are looking at expanding that line and putting another tank in with possibly some storage, a storage tank that will gravity feed to a couple more tanks down the road. And then secondly, and she also touched on this too, for a lot of these properties, we're looking at different fencing strategies to where we can put in more or less a water gap in certain areas around the Fenns, not necessarily to where they're going down into the Fenns, but in other areas of the riparian zone itself, where we can kind of protect the fin. And then also we're starting a lot of grazing management plans with some of these lessees in that area, to where we rotate cattle to where their livestock isn't in there at certain times of the year. That's more detrimental to the actual fin itself, when we have more what we call hummocking, where they punch through and everything. So that's all I wanted to say on that.
Thanks, Justin.
for that. Thanks.
Mindy, you mentioned financial resources or investments. Can we use I&D funds for any of this? I would imagine if we improve the condition of these, that would have there may not, I don't know if that translates into the ability to generate more revenue, but would certainly improve the value of the land, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. We haven't really looked in detail at exactly what the source of funding would be. There's even a possibility we could apply for grant funding. The protection of these sites meets a number of criteria that organizations are looking for. We're going to come back to you after we meet with our lessees and look at these fen enhancement plans. Every property is so different. You know, some of them have 1 fen, some have 4. It really is going to be a matter of sitting down and working with our lessees. And I'll be honest, I don't know how it's going to work. What I want to say is I don't know how it'll work on each property. And we really sincerely want to work with our lessees on their ideas. They know these areas, you know, what their goals are. And so what we're doing is planning to come back to you in the next year. And this is a plan that we're going to be phasing in over a number of years. So I don't have that information exactly how we're going to pay for it, because I don't know exactly what we'll need.
Okay. Are there any of our attendees, members of the public, who wish to make comment on this item? If so, raise your hand. Seeing none.
Not seeing any.
I would entertain a motion to approve the Fen Stewardship Action Plan as presented. Commissioner Heath?
Yes. I move that the board approve the Fen Stewardship Action Plan, and that the actions taken under the plan and results be reviewed by this board each year, and a decision to continue or cease efforts under the plan will be made in 5 years. And I just have to ask you, in that picture, is that a wild iris that you're showing in that fen?
Yes, it is.
Oh my gosh.
You've got an eye there, Commissioner.
No, and I think we all need to do when we get back to doing field trips, let's look at a very interesting one. So that would
be good.
Forgive the diversion.
Okay, been moved by Commissioner Heath.
Second.
Second by Commissioner Shaw. Any further discussion? All right, we'll do a roll call vote. If in favor, indicate by saying aye. Commissioner Heath?
Aye.
Commissioner Scanlon?
Aye.
Commissioner Shaw?
Aye.
Commissioner Carney?
Aye.
And I vote in favor. Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you very much, commissioners.
We're right back to you, Mindy.
Okay.
You hold the floor. We're at tab 9, the Greater Sage Grouse Stewardship Action Plan.
I'm assuming you can see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So the second Stewardship Action Plan I'd like to present to you is the Greater Sage Grouse Stewardship Action Plan. It's a renewal. The board first considered this in September of 2016, and at that time set a time effective period of 4 years to coincide with the Fish and Wildlife Service's reconsideration of the listing of the species. That action is supposed to be released October 1st, and so the renewal of this plan at this time is important. So what I'm asking you today is to help preserve a species. These birds, this picture was taken of 2 greater sage grouse flying away from one of our contractors on a property in Moffat County. Greater sage grouse habitat, their native range comprises 11 western states and 2 Canadian provinces. This map shows that the lighter gray area is where greater sage grouse still exist, and the darker areas are areas where they no longer exist. And you'll see that the area in Colorado is actually a fairly small part of this large habitat area. And in fact, it's been over the last 20 years when scientists realized that greater sage grouse are disappearing, that there's been this concerted effort by all these states and Canadian provinces of how do we address this loss of habitat for this iconic bird of the West, and how do we work together on that. The bird was listed as not threatened in September of 2015, and yet this Fish and Wildlife comes back and looks at that decision every 5 years. And so that's why we're looking at this now. Our goal is to help prevent a listing of the species. In Colorado, greater sage grouse habitat falls within 5 northwestern counties. Most of the habitat is in Moffat County and Jackson, but there are also substantial populations in Routt, Grand, and northern Eagle counties. There are 2 types of greater sage grouse habitat. There's priority habitat, which is shown here in this pinkish purple, and general habitat, which is shown in green. The priority habitat is defined largely by the presence of greater sage grouse elects, where the birds have their spring breeding grounds, and in which they spend most of their lives within 4 miles of those breeding grounds. The green areas are general habitat, which meet the conditions for favorable habitat, but we don't find many birds there. Our surface ownership, about 3/4 of our ownership on the surface is located within this priority habitat, which is the most important. And about 1/3 or 28% or 1/4 is in general habitat. I want to go over a little bit of our lease highlights for our surface and subsurface lands within greater sage grouse habitat. These numbers don't all add up, and I just want to kind of show you the relative scale for comparison. We have 372,000 acres of which at least part of that land is within greater sage grouse habitat. Those are the areas that are, and this is also the area that's leased for grazing or leased for agriculture. All of our land within greater sage grouse habitat are leased. We have 151 grazing leases. This is in contrast to just the 9 that were in the Fen Stewardship Action Plan. We have just over 11,000 acres of dry crop land. That's just 3% of the land that's in greater sage grouse habitat. And most of that is located in Moffat County. The public access program has nearly 300,000 acres, and private recreation leases comprise 73,600 acres or so. So basically we have, of all the land that's leased for recreational use, 1/5 of it is leased for private use and 4/5 are in the public access program. It is still legal to hunt greater sage grouse, although the season of it is limited to just a week or 2, I think in the fall, and on very selected properties. Renewable energy acres, there are no current active leases in greater sage grouse habitat. And we have a little over 450,000 acres of mineral ownership within greater sage grouse habitat. Currently, there are just under 40,000 acres that are in active oil and gas leasing. This is actually down significantly from 4 years ago, but that's largely due to the downturn in oil and gas leasing in this general area, as opposed to our stewardship action plan. That's what we believe. And then finally, almost 54,000 acres of solid mineral leases in greater sage grouse habitat. The dominant use is coal mining within this area. So the main goal of our greater sage grouse stewardship action plan is to align with other agencies. The primary one is the BLM approved Resource Management Plan Amendment. This is the plan that was adopted by BLM, and BLM owns about 45% of all the land in greater sage grouse habitat. Our state land board owns about 10%. And the other one is to stand also and align with Colorado Parks and Wildlife's leasing stipulations for energy development within greater sage grouse habitat. What makes this stewardship action plan different than some of our others is that the BLM ARMPA, or the Resource Management Plan, contains these 4 key elements that are very different from our other stewardship action plans. And the board approved these 4 years ago. I'm going to go through these one at a time. Excuse me, I'm sorry. One is the LEC buffer stipulations, disturbance caps, adaptive management triggers, and finally, adoption of a net conservation gain. These are elements that are used throughout the other states as well. So these were adopted specifically for Colorado, but many of the other 11 Western states utilize these same elements. The first is the LEC buffer stipulation. So as I mentioned before, birds spend most of their time within 4 miles of a LEC. And so we have adopted the provision that there be no surface occupancy for any new leasing within 4 miles of an active LEC, along with timing stipulations that oil and gas activity would only occur outside of the LECing period. There are also a few other stipulations that are outlined in the Stewardship Action Plan that address noise disturbance and things like that. There's a much less restrictive restrictions in the green in the green or the general habitat, where there's only a 2-mile buffer from an active LEC. And those also would be subject to timing stipulations. The second element are disturbance caps. And what this addresses is how much land within these general areas, within these what BLM calls management zones. They've identified 21 different zones within greater sage-grouse habitat in Northwest Colorado. The State Land Board owns land in all but 4 of these management zones. And what they're saying is that they'd like to reduce as much as possible the amount of land that's disturbed within each zone. And so there are disturbance caps that they've established. And I'll cover these with the next slide. So within these zones, they've adopted adaptive management triggers that are now incorporated into our Stewardship Action Plan. These involve soft triggers and hard triggers. And what these triggers are basically lines in the sand that if something happened, we'll take a step back and start reviewing what changes have to be made. The soft trigger has to do with how much land is disturbed within these specific management zones. They've set a cap, a top amount of only 3% of the land can be disturbed. It should not be exceeded. And only 1 disturbance on average for every 640 acres. If those are exceeded, this would trigger management changes. And so BLM is has since 5 years ago been tracking any new kind of development. And there's a list of those kinds of development that are listed in the Stewardship Action Plan. The hard triggers have to do with the populations. So if you can look at this as this area of Northwest Colorado, these are the 6 different areas where greater sage-grouse live. This is kind of this area up here. This is Moffat County, Jackson County to the right, and then these 4 sub-population areas. And so the hard triggers really address only the 2 largest populations. If there's a 75% decline in the number of birds in each of these 2 major populations, or 30% of the habitat is lost for whatever reason, this would trigger immediate cessation of new leasing, and then the parties, the stakeholders involved would gather together to see what kind of response should be developed. I will say that this 3% disturbance cap has, out of these 21 management zones, only 1 has exceeded 3%, and it exceeded it 4 years ago. Most of these management zones are all under 0.5%. So we still have quite a bit of cushion for any, for allowing some new development without triggering this soft trigger. And finally, the last element that we've adopted and incorporated into the Stewardship Action Plan is net conservation gain. That means whatever kind of impact, when it's said and done, there'll be a net positive impact to greater sage-grouse habitat. And so this is done by adopting the mitigation framework, which is avoid whenever possible, avoid greater sage-grouse habitat and avoid impacting it. This could involve not leasing selected properties if we felt the potential impact was too great. We have, since the adoption of the Greater Sage-Grouse Stewardship Action Plan, the board has not avoided from leasing any particular properties because of the Stewardship Action Plan. If leasing did go forward, we would want to minimize the amount of impact by applying buffer distances and lease stipulations. And finally, mitigate. This is to compensate for any residual impacts. Once the leasing is done, or once the development is done, typically when a pad is developed, the pad is then downsized after construction occurs. So any permanent impacts from oil and gas, solid minerals, renewable energy, and rights of way would be either mitigated through participation in the Colorado Habitat Exchange or through collaboration with CBW. We'll note that the Colorado Habitat Exchange is not yet functioning. We're still expecting that it will be, but until such time that it does become available, mitigation would occur in collaboration with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. The Stewardship Action Plan also includes leasing directives, which would be used for screening new leases through range management. All the range management stipulations are all voluntary at this time and don't exceed what's already existing in the existing grazing leases. Oil and gas development through either new leasing or expansion of existing leases. New solid mineral development would be subject to leasing stipulations in the Stewardship Action Plan, as would renewable energy development, recreation, rights of way, and rights of way, excuse me. And finally, and also staff is also applying some management directions or directives from the Stewardship Action Plan that include restoring sagebrush lands, restoring riparian and wet meadow projects, reducing conifer encroachment. Our hydroax is currently up in Northwest Colorado, and they're prioritizing projects that are within greater sage-grouse habitat, managing the threat of wildfire, reducing impacts of roads. That would be basically trying to not create any new roads and where possible eliminating existing roads, and consider greater sage-grouse habitat when looking at decisions whether to acquire or dispose of land. Part of the preparation for the Greater Sage-Grouse Stewardship Action Plan 4 years ago was the assessment of all state trust lands within Greater Sage-Grouse habitat. This shows a tape measure, and information was collected on vegetation within Greater Sage-Grouse habitat. We did that for over 130 properties involving about 250,000 acres on state trust land. And that information was then incorporated into the Habitat Exchange's quantification tool, which basically took in a series of factors from multi-scale, regional scale, and site level information to estimate the number of credits on any particular property based on the information we collected. Again, we're hoping that that system will one day soon become functional. And finally, as with the Fen Stewardship Action Plan, we always have an adaptive management component, which means as we learn, we come back to you. We'll be presenting an annual report to you on enhancement projects that have occurred within Greater Sage-Grouse habitat, any leasing activity, and anything withheld from leasing, the financial impact to the agency's revenue, and any adaptive management recommendations. Staff recommendation is that the board approve the Greater Sage-Grouse Stewardship Action Plan for a period of 5 years. Staff will review the results of implementing the plan with you each year. And we ask that you review your decision to continue or cease efforts under this plan in 5 years, in 2025. So, and then are there any questions?
All right, thanks, Mindy. Any questions for Mindy? Have we seen, and maybe we haven't been able to really measure, but since 16, have we seen measurable results in sort of habitat restoration or increase in populations, or too early?
Yeah, it's it's not too early. CBW annually tracks all Greater Sage-Grouse populations through spring let counts, and actually those numbers typically widely vary from year to year. They actually are currently down from what they were in 2016, but not to the levels that would trigger any, I guess, real concerns or changes to these measures. I have been working with our district managers on identifying, well, it's mostly Jared Smith because it's in Greater Sage-Grouse, because it's in Northwest Colorado. We're currently working on 2 wet meadow restoration projects, one in Moffat County and one in Jackson County. And that also involves fencing and working closely with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Staff basically feels there's not been a significant financial impact from the Stewardship Action Plan, and that it remains a really important component of Colorado Parks and Wildlife's response to protecting the greater sage-grouse and as part of this larger regional effort, and to prevent a listing of the species.
Okay, thanks. Commissioner Heath?
Yeah, Mindy, in your report, you talk about departing from the BLM recommendations for oil and gas within 1 mile. In a situation like that, who prevails if our regulations are different than the BLM regulations?
Well, you know, our regulations only apply to state trust lands. So BLM would never have authorization or authority over our state trust lands. I should have pointed out that at the time 4 years ago when that was written in the current version, and I didn't make changes in the plan that's attached as Exhibit B at this time, but BLM ended up dropping that recommendation of no leasing within 1 mile. And so that was something that we had departed from BLM on at that time, and then subsequently they ended up dropping it as well. So at this point, we're very consistent with what they're recommending.
And in your hard triggers, you talk about, you would look at new leases. And because most of the land for habitat for the sage grouse is already moderate or poor, why wouldn't we look at existing leases as well?
To look at existing leases for, I'm sorry?
Well, when you talked about on the hard triggers, what you would do, and you talked about instances and.
Oh, I'm sorry, right. Well, for existing leases, we're really already governed by our existing leases, which are contracts. And so all this leasing recommendations and stipulations in the Stewardship Action Plan really address new leases going forward. And so any new leases that were approved after September of 2016 are subject to these restrictions. Okay. That doesn't mean that if existing leases expand through through expansion, that they might not be subject to some of these, but most of the recommendations and stipulations really can only address the new leasing.
Thank you.
Okay, don't see any. Commissioner Shaw?
No comment.
Okay. Any members of the public wish to speak to this matter? Just raise your virtual hand. I see none. I would then entertain a motion to approve the Greater Sage Grouse Stewardship Action Plan as presented.
This is Commissioner Scanlon. I move that we adopt this Greater Sage Grouse Stewardship Action Plan as presented. And I will note, I worked on this, gosh, in 2010. So it all is remaining terribly consistent, but thank you.
Second. Then moved by Commissioner Scanlon, second by Commissioner Carney. A roll call vote, if in favor, indicate by saying aye. Commissioner Heath?
Aye.
Commissioner Scanlon?
Aye.
Commissioner Shaw?
Aye.
Commissioner Carney?
Aye.
And I vote in favor. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you very much, Mindy. It's
good work.
To see you. Our next item, policy review, recreation leasing 300-005, tab 10 and A.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Let me share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
Yep.
All right. Well, again, good afternoon, commissioners. A Medina, for the record, A Medina, Recreation Program Manager with the State Land Board. So I'm here today, or this afternoon, to present on the regularly scheduled 3-year review of the board's recreation leasing policy and ask for approval of proposed changes as presented in the board packet. Bear with me. So as staff believes that there are 2 important outcomes from the changes proposed to the board's recreation leasing policy, including an increase in leasing efficiency on rec leases and also improved clarity of the recreation policy itself. A little bit of background on the rec leasing policy. It was originally adopted in 2014, in May of 2014, and at that time it replaced what had currently been called the multiple use policy, which had started in 1994. The new policy set a minimum lease rate for standard 5-year recreation leases and created more or less, it created the competitive bidding policy that we have currently today on rec leases. As outlined in the board packet, there are a number of proposed revisions to the policy. However, I did want to just highlight a few of the larger changes that are being proposed by staff. The first one is an increase in the minimum standard rec lease rate from $2 an acre to $2.25 per acre. This change is consistent with inflation over the last 6 years since this policy took effect in 2014. The change was informed by using the inflation calculator put together by the federal government. Also related to this minimum, staff is requesting the ability to negotiate a lower lease rate on lower than this minimum on properties that are landlocked, and this would be properties, for instance, a 640-acre parcel that might be entirely within private land, or it could also be a situation where we have a piece of state trust land that is surrounded mostly by very difficult terrain to get to, and therefore we'd have a limited market to, it'd be difficult to lease as a result. Another big policy change is to allow staff approval of new recreation leases. Currently, the way that recreation leases work, the board approves all new recreation leases, and when we don't really have through the board leasing agenda, we don't really have rec renewals. The lease class itself does not have any renewal rights. So typically, when we have a property that comes up that's expiring on a rec lease, and it's open for anybody to apply for, including the existing recreation lessee. And everybody is looked at essentially on the same grounds at that time. This change as proposed would allow staff, as mentioned, staff approval of rec leases, and it actually would increase some efficiency in this leasing, since it would allow staff to approve. When we have a new lease come to the board, we have to schedule it for a board meeting, which happen on a once a month frequency. This allows us to be allows staff to be a little bit quicker in approving leases, since staff can approve new ones as long as they are standard 5-year leases and they meet the $2.25 minimum that we're proposing. And then finally, the policy formalizes a process that when leases are turned in early by a rec lessee, or turned in sometime within the 5-year period, that party would then be disqualified from applying for that same rec lease again on the property for a period of 5 years. And what that does is it helps us maintain the integrity of the competitive bidding process, so that you can't, somebody can't come in, bid really high to obtain the lease and then turn it in a year later to try to negotiate a lower rate on the property. So we've, in practice, have done that over the past 5 years. However, we wanted it to be formalized within the policy itself, so we can point to it when challenged on it. As mentioned, we're requesting the staff approval of standard rec leases, and we do believe that that will help increase efficiency in leasing. I presented some numbers within the board packet just of the number of rec leases that have come on the board leasing agenda over the last, I believe I did the last, between 2018 and 2020. There are 73 recreation leases on the board leasing agenda for approval. 16 of those were competitive bids, and the board approved all of those, did approve all of those leases. Anything that's I just want to be clear though, anything that's a competitive bid would still have to come to the board on the board leasing agenda, since they could be challenged by either party that's applying for it or that had bid on it. And then, as mentioned, the policy changes, it still requires that all non-standard leases, so anything longer than 5-year term, anything below the $2.25 per acre minimum lease rate, and then also anything that's a competitive bid would still have to go to the board for approval. That's outlined in the policy. So with that, staff is recommending board approval of the proposed modifications or revisions to the recreation leasing policy number 300-005 as outlined in the board cover sheet. Does the board have any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Abe. Any questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Commissioner Heath.
Yeah, what are the majority of these recreational uses?
So probably close to about 75% of our recreation leases are for hunting purposes, private hunting or guided hunting.
As your pictures show otherwise.
Yeah, our hunting's a difficult topic to show in a slideshow, and we don't have a lot of pictures of folks participating in hunting, but we have other uses. The one on the screen itself is a 100-mile running race that happens up in Chaffee County that we have under an agreement. So yeah, but the vast majority are for hunting purposes.
Assume it's pre-COVID too.
Yeah, that is pre-COVID. I anticipated that question coming up because it was a sizable crowd.
That'd be great. Oh gosh. All right. Any other questions for Abe? Are there any of our attendees, members of the public, who wish to make comment? You can raise your virtual hand. Seeing none, back to our commissioners, I would entertain a motion.
Based on the information provided to this board today, September 9th, I recommend we approve the recommended changes to the recreation leasing policy 300-005.
Thank you. It's been moved by Commissioner Heath.
Second.
Second by Commissioner Shaw. Any further comment or discussion? All in favor indicate by saying aye. Roll call vote. Commissioner Shaw.
Aye.
Commissioner Carney.
Aye.
Commissioner Scanlon.
Aye.
Commissioner Heath.
Seemed to have lost her for a moment.
She stepped away. I vote in favor. We're at 4-0. We'll go ahead and note that Commissioner Heath did not participate in the vote. The motion passes 4-0. Thanks, Abe.
Thank you, commissioners.
All right, next item, final action item F, board leasing agenda for September, tab 11. Ms. Hawthorne.
Good
Welcome.
afternoon, commissioners. For the record, I'm Alicia Hawthorne. I'm on the Transactions and Record Services team, and this is the September 2020 board leasing agenda. We have 10 items, 3 of which are competitive bids. This month, they're all agriculture, as Abe just mentioned. So many of them were recreation leases in the past, but this month we have 3 competitive bids that are all agriculture, and then we have 7 new leases, 3 of which are agriculture leases, 2 are rights of ways, and then we also have 2 solar leases that are on this month's board agenda. board leasing agenda. So I'll certainly try to answer any questions that you may have. And are there any questions?
Any questions? All right. Are there, let me see, any members of the public wish to make comment on this item? Seeing none, I entertain a motion.
So move we approve the board leasing agenda.
Okay.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Shaw, second by Commissioner Carney. Any further discussion? Take a roll call vote. All in favor, or if in favor, indicate by saying aye. Commissioner Shaw.
Aye.
Commissioner Scanlon.
Aye.
Commissioner Carney.
Aye.
And I vote in favor. Commissioner Heath is absent for the vote, so the motion passes 4-0.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you, Alicia. Appreciate it. Next is our minutes from August 2020. Were there any edits, changes for the August minutes?
I have one.
Okay.
On the chart, I'm on page 203. On the chart where it talks about final action, it doesn't show any action on the election of the board president and vice president or the representative to the Permanent Fund Investment Committee. And I think we did take action and probably just should have that reflected in the minutes.
That's on page
203. And there's a meeting summary of the final actions.
Oh, okay.
It shows under board vote that there was either no action or not applicable. I'm not sure which, but I mean, I think in terms of the actual functioning of the board, we should show that we elect
Sure.
officers.
Okay. I'm not sure who owns that, if that's Tracy, Kim, or Barb. But could we make that addition for the record?
I mean, all those yard signs that Christine put up, all that. We won't.
Hello, commissioners. That's my oversight.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Yep.
Yeah, that's my oversight. I'll make sure that there's a note in these minutes that says that they will be added to the record.
All right. Well, thank you. That concludes our final action items. Everyone doing all right? Okay. We have no current requests for review. We're on to information items. And Director Ryan has stepped away for another call. So Nick,
Commissioner, I'm happy to.
Nick Massey is on, has stepped in. We'll start with the staff report, which is tab 13. And I'm trying to get there. Are there any questions from our commissioners from the staff report?
Commissioner, I just want to throw out there that on the 2 wildfires that we had noted in the staff report, the Williams Fork fire has grown very little and not really created any greater threat to state trust property. And despite the tremendous growth of Cameron Peak, it's away from the State Forest State Park, really? Causing significant concern up there, of course.
Right.
It's moving away from the state forest?
Yeah, yeah. And between the map that was in the packet and today's map, it's basically tripled, but it's all to the east.
Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, into a lot of more residential area.
Yeah. Well, that's all true. They have the State Forest Service is managing the fire protection on the state forest for us on our behalf under our lease. And they have taken steps to cut fire lines and things on the state forest. So in anticipation of the fact that it could move, there has been some work done on the state forest on the west side of the pass.
Okay. Any other questions or comments around the staff report? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to information item, what is it, 3B, North Masters Land for Land Exchange, tab 14, with Matt Pollard. Matt?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're sort of a little in and out.
Okay, commissioners, can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go.
All right, great. Thank you. Hi, I'm Matt Pollard, North Central District Manager. I'm here today to give a brief update on a land for land exchange that the board approved back in May. As a reminder, I'm showing the map from my proposal in May. You will recall the situation. I'll try to point it with my cursor here. There's a parcel of state trust land that's somewhat inundated by Riverside Reservoir and a few other small parcels that are interspersed in this area. Staff structured a trade which involves the exchange of these 320 acres of trust land for 1.5 shares of Morgan Pruitt Reservoir Company. That's some irrigation water out in Northeast Colorado, plus $170,000 cash. You'll recall I met with the board in executive session at that time and shared valuation information indicating that the exchange is in fact to the benefit of the trust. So following board approval, staff noticed the transaction for 4 weeks in the local newspaper, the Greeley Tribune. On July 9th, staff opened 2 sealed bids. Now, one of those bids was conditioned on access across the adjacent state trust land. The published notice did not include access. In fact, one of the stated benefits of the exchange was that it remedied an encumbrance, not creating a new encumbrance. However, in order to be sure that there was no ambiguity, staff rejected the bids at that time and re-noticed the exchange for another 4 weeks. Again, but even more clearly stating that the property is offered as is, where is, without access across the adjacent trust land. After 4 weeks notice, staff opened 2 sealed bids. Assistant Attorney General Corey Haller then reviewed those bids for compliance with the posted notice. Mr. Haller concluded that again, one bid was conditioned on access that was not offered as part of the exchange, and as such was invalid. So the remaining bid from the Riverside Reservoir and Land Company was for 1.5 shares of Morgan Pruitt Water and $250,000 cash. The final step in any exchange is explicitly laid out in statute. That step allows the existing agricultural lessee on the parcel the opportunity to enter into a step auction with the high bidder if they choose. Our ag lessee on this particular parcel is Equus Farms, and they had in fact preserved their statutory right by giving the appropriate notice to staff prior to the bid opening. Staff has contacted Equus last week to schedule a step auction against the winning bid, that bid again being 1.5 shares of Morgan Pruitt Water and $250,000 cash. Incidentally, I would point out that this bid exceeded the proposed exchange I brought to you in May by $70,000. We received word back from Equus Farms, the agricultural lessee, late last week, that after some consideration, they do not wish to exercise their right and they withdrew from scheduling a step auction. Therefore, according to the terms of the May board approval, staff will conclude this exchange with Riverside Reservoir and Land Company in a timely fashion this fall. I just wanted to give you an update and would answer any questions if you have them.
Okay. I was prepared for something. I thought it was a little bit more complex. I didn't realize. So they just for my benefit though, we take sealed bids, and then someone still has a right to do a step auction?
So yes, the old statute 118 says that an existing agricultural lessee, if we ever choose to sell or dispose of land they lease, they do get ultimately a chance to enter into a step auction with the high bidder, simply by preserving their right. And it's either to attend the bid opening, that was the old way for the last 100 years, but more recently, if they even notify staff with a letter or email ahead of the bid opening, they've preserved that right. And in this case, they, after preserving the right, they decided after some consideration that they didn't wish to enter into a step auction for it.
And Equus, do they own all the red stuff or lease all the red stuff?
So, of course, the red stuff we don't own. That is stuff we disposed of in 1944.
Oh, right.
So,
okay.
So,
we're talking about the green stuff.
They do lease all of the blue, which is the state land.
Okay.
They're actually the largest lessee in my district.
Okay.
So back to that question about the step auction. So if they decide to exercise that right, then does the minimum bid start as what high bid was in the sealed bids?
That's correct, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, it's a good update.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions for Matt? All right. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Our next item, financial update, tab 15. Nick?
Yes, sir. Give me a moment to bring everything up. Shoot. Sorry, juggling hosting and presenting is a little bit tricky.
Tap your head, rub your tummy.
Here we go. I'm getting it.
Got it.
Okay. Great. Well, good afternoon, commissioners. This is Nick Massey, Assistant Director, here to walk through some pieces of data about our financial performance for the last year and looking forward a little bit. This presentation is an overview for the record of a massive amount of material in your board packet. Next month, I want to point out that Greg and his team will bring you the details about the results and expectations per line of business. So this month is really all about summary data. Just a reminder that I cater this presentation and the associated reports to emphasize results on the school trust. When taking all trust earnings and expenses into account, the numbers get about 2% larger. So there are occasions where numbers may feel a little bit off, but it's school trust versus all trust. And just waiting for my system to catch up on a click here. So the year that just ended, June 30, was about as good as it gets these days, $169 million. It's a pretty outstanding year. But for next year, a little bit less rosy. More on that in a bit. So give me a chance here to first review last year. $169 million isn't pocket change, of course, it's tremendous. But it's about 6% less than we earned last year, which translates to about $10 million less. I want to highlight a few lines. The commercial portfolio distributed 37% more revenue to the trust than the previous year. And minerals saw a 9% decline, which was weighted to the final months of the year that otherwise was on track to be as good a year or better than the previous year. concerning minerals. Declines in mineral bonus and surface use agreements, which are traditionally variable and historically strong, reflected uncertainty in the market ahead of related to impacts on the production of oil and gas. Gravel rents, while relatively small, had a great year, growing 200%, and renewable energy continues to grow year after year. This year, we're conservatively forecasting school trust earnings at $125 million, which is not peanuts either, right? It's pretty good. But that does translate into a 26% decline year over year, which is almost entirely driven by oil and gas revenue decline. All other lines are roughly flat or growing in double-digit territory or more. Grazing revenues are likely up as a result of rate increases we've achieved in the last year. With federal regulatory approval expected on one of our ecosystem services projects, the long-awaited sale of credits looks to begin this year. And again, renewable energy continues its growth with a list of projects in the works. The commercial portfolio will also likely increase its distribution to the trust this year. So where exactly does $169 million in revenues go? It continues to cost us about $7 million to run the organization annually. You approved $500,000 of new investments into school trust properties through our investment and development fund. And we completed investments in projects, including new homes on the Chancellor, the development and implementation of an asset management plan for Lowry, cleanup of 2 properties, and broker services on the Bald Mountain disposition. Department of Education saw about $100 million from us between distribution of operating earnings to BESS and of permanent fund earnings distribution to the School Finance Act. The resulting deposit to the permanent fund was $62 million, or 37% of the year's earnings. You heard this morning that the permanent, in a presentation, that the permanent fund won't see any deposit next year. And that is frustrating to those of us who care about growing that asset. So I want to transition briefly to our annual reporting on the transactions that we completed this year. We had about $2 million in acquisitions and $15 million in dispositions. That's the value of the properties that were transacted in those ways. We had transactions involving water rights. We acquired lessee improvements at the end of a lease. We had some small parcel cleanup and property aggregation that we talk about adding value to the trust property. And we had the opportunity to dispose of some properties that were prime opportunity to move to their next best use. Some fairly urban property was in there in the third closing that happened on 48th and Tower. So what does fiscal year 2021 have in store? We're a few months in. This is kind of our pattern. We look to forecasting revenue after we get a bit of a start to the year. Unfortunately, we're forecasting, as I said, total earnings down this year, which is about 26% decrease, or $44 million less than last year. We have a slightly smaller budget, about 6%, but the pieces that are smaller really are those costs that we don't have discretion over. They're sort of assigned to us by state entities in which we share the cost. We would expect I&D spending to be fairly consistent with what it's been over the longer term. And we'll end the year with that revenue sweep to the School Finance Act related to House Bill 20-1418. So just to kind of wrap it all up, for next year, we're expecting reduced operating revenues in a steady expense environment. And we have that legislative sweep of remaining revenues so that no operating funds from State Land Board go to the permanent fund this year. As I mentioned, Greg and his team next month are planning to bring you details on lines of business reporting. But I'm happy to entertain any questions kind of on this summary level information.
All right, thanks, Nick. Any questions from commissioners? I think
Assistant Director Okish has a question.
Oh, yeah, Assistant Director Okish.
So Nick, I don't mean to ambush you. How did
Start the chump.
Understood you correctly? If the budgets, if the revenue's getting smaller, but for the most part our budgets are staying the same, how did it become less of a? The pie got smaller, but the percentage that our operating costs of that pie didn't get bigger, right? On your little table, on your pie chart, you said it'll be 6% operating costs next year.
No, the decrease in the operating costs was 6% as well. So we're this year we were at about 7.1, 7.2 million, and next year it's like 6.9, and it's a few $100,000 different related to those costs that come out of shared costs with the rest of government. So it's a 6% decrease in the operating budget.
I see. Okay, thank you.
But yep.
My salary's not going to change, is it?
You didn't notice yet, so.
A 6% decrease.
That's what I'm afraid of.
And I see Atlas is budgeted. We're maintaining our commitment there.
Yes, sir. We have the annual costs that we apply to licensing and kind of a basic bucket of money for service. The spending that the board approved in June, I believe, we hadn't, because of state government budgeting concerns and really the optics around budget, we delayed the kickoff of that project, but we're really close to getting that started this year.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for, I do lease purchase agreements. I see we report none. What is that? What would that look like if we had one?
That's a great question. Because we haven't had any, I honestly couldn't tell you. I haven't spent much time understanding them. But,
okay.
I can bring that. Let me bring that question back to you next month.
I mean, assume if we file a report that at some point we had one, but I was curious. Okay.
Just maintaining the statute on reporting.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Nick. Next item. Did you have something, Ed? Or you're just queuing up?
Well, queuing up, and a lease purchase scenario is something you guys got authorization about 8 or 10 years ago. It's basically a financing tool for building a building, leasing it out, and having it ultimately purchased. So it provides a financing mechanism to actually build some improvements.
Is that how we built 1127?
Actually, I think 1127 sort of highlighted the value of having a lease improvement authorization, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And so that's when that legislation was proposed. But frankly, I'm not sure it's ever actually been used.
Used. Okay. All right. Thank you. Director Ryan sent out proposed dates for 2021. Did anyone have any issues or concerns about those? It's sort of continuing on the second Wednesdays and Thursdays. Does that work for everyone? And he did note with the rolling off of potentially 3 of us in June, this latter half you guys might have to revisit based on new commissioners' schedules and such, but we'll certainly go with that. All right, and then our last item, Assistant Attorney General Hamrick, are you leading the discussion?
Nick's going to start off, and then I'll pick it up in the middle, and Nick's going to bring it home.
Okay, awesome. Nick.
Same deal. Give me just a second.
Are you timing us, John?
Yes. Go.
Okay.
Hey, Gary.
Yes.
I may have a conflict with one of those dates in March because I have a vacation that I moved from 2020 to 2021.
Okay.
I don't think we need to worry about it just yet.
Okay. Thank you. I'll let Bill know.
Okay. Am I displaying my slideshow
Yes.
okay?
Yep.
Great. Good afternoon again, Commissioners. Nick Massey, Assistant Director for the record. Here to bring you some notes about what we're calling boards and commissions best practices. I'm here with Assistant Attorney General Ed Hamrick, who I'll do a handoff to about halfway through. And then, as Ed mentioned, I'll kind of close this out with some final comments and a question. So in your board packet this month, you have a copy of CRS 24-3.7-102. That statute was created to remind all boards and commissions of the duties they uphold and to guide the relevant supporting agencies in their work with their board. This presentation is meant to serve as a reminder of the things State Land Board staff do to support you, the commissioners, in upholding your fiduciary duty. Guidance to board and staff comes from a variety of places. Our mission and our vision, of course, our strategic plan, which the board is helpful in creating as well. Constitution and the statutes that govern the board and staff in our work with lessees, our general operations, and our revenues. And the board policy book, where we further document the authority given to staff by the board. It's on the board policy book that I want to spend a little extra time this afternoon. So we'll review a few of the major components, and we'll highlight a few of the recent updates. Within boards and commissions best practice, there's a component of conflict of interest, and we've already done our update for the year, so I'm not going to spend additional time on that this afternoon. Ed is going to spend some time discussing open meetings law and the law surrounding the Colorado Open Records Act. And I'll wrap with a quick review of the things that staff does to keep all of this stuff organized. And like I said, I'll have a question for you, so be on your toes. So if you're ready, entertain me while I dig into the board policy book a little bit. We divide our policies into the following components. Management of trust assets in the 100 series. Administrative policy in the 200 series, land use policy in the 300 series, portfolio management in the 400 series, minerals management in the 500 series, and commercial policies in the 600 series. We put our policies on a revision schedule that has us review them and update them no less often than every 3 years. Policies that are in need of off-cycle revision are brought to the board whenever they're really needed. This month, you've been asked to approve revisions to the recreation leasing policy from the land use section, for example. And in the past year, you've approved revisions to or creation of policies covering a wide range of activities. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing on my end and hand off to Ed, and Ed's going to continue on with open meetings law and KORA.
All right. Hold on, I'm getting a strange sign.
We're seeing you on this end.
There we go. Okay. Do you have my slideshow up?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you. We're almost at the end of the meeting. We are all committed to managing Colorado's trust lands in an open and transparent way. And the board has embraced these principles historically through its governance manual, its bylaws, its policies, and its practices. And in fact, the board is something of a leader in the whole best practices approach that is that's been tried to be captured by the General Assembly in its best practices statute. But one of the things that's always good to do is review some of the legal basics of open meetings and open records. And I want to highlight a couple of areas that even the well-meaning boards can misstep. For the record, I'm Ed Hamrick, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to chat with you. So we'll start with open meetings, or Colorado Sunshine Law. And it basically embodies the principle that in a free and democratic society, government, policy, and decision-making is made openly for all the citizens to view and not in secret. And we do that through public meetings that include minutes that are open for public inspection. Under the open meetings law, anytime two or more commissioners get together to discuss public business or take any formal action, you have an actual public meeting. It's a pretty low standard. It includes meetings that are in person, which feels like a thing of the past, horse-drawn carriage, but in person, virtual meetings like we have now, and then some can be a little more subtle, meetings that are by telephone and meetings by email. And again, the meeting is triggered whenever two or more commissioners are having conversations about public business by any of these venues. So how do we go about making sure that we're in a public meeting and are complying with statutes? Primarily, we give notice to the public with an agenda of the topics that are being discussed, so anybody who's interested can listen in or attend the meeting. We also take minutes so that those meetings can be reviewed and people can see what the board did. The board, in its practices and bylaws, allows public comment for its action items, but public comment is not a component that's required for an open meeting. And I highlight that just to make sure that everyone recognizes that our workshops or our information items or anything where we're not taking public comment still is an open meeting and still is open to the public. So,
I mean, just a quick question on that.
Yeah.
So with, I mean, public comments at our discretion?
From a open meeting standpoint, yes. So from a Administrative Procedures Act standpoint, for people who have property interests that are being determined, they're entitled to an opportunity to present. And so, you know, I'm not really digging deep into the Administrative Procedures Act issues, But that is all, not all of your decision-making items really qualify as sort of a quasi-adjudicatory decision, but some do, and that captures allowing the public to present. But when you're not making a decision, like your workshop and information items, the real distinction is not a public meetings distinction. It's a distinction by whether you are planning to take action at that time or not. And so that's why public comment isn't necessarily required.
Got it.
Okay. So some examples of public meetings. Our board meetings every month and the workshops are public meetings, and I think that's pretty clear. And staff does a great job of taking care of most of the commissioners' compliance issues. Staff's taking care of the minutes, is issuing the public notices, and is really handling the compliance issue. I want to note something again, back into horse-drawn carriages, but when we meet in person, to remember that side conversations on a break, if it's about an agenda item, is still part of the public meeting. Comments between commissioners at the desk or during a meeting is part of the public meeting. So if commissioners lean over and whisper a joke to each other, that's technically part of the public meeting because of the discussion that's going on. What I really want to highlight is for the commissioners to be sensitive to the optics in those types of scenarios, that the audience and the people who are there that are waiting to hear your decision and your reason for your decision don't know what you're discussing when they can't hear it. And so innocent comments start to look very concerning if you're a lessee who's worried about what the ultimate board's decision is going to be made. Social gatherings are not public meetings. So again, when the board is traveling or when members are coming in to Denver before a board meeting and have dinner, that's typically not a public meeting. But as soon as you start talking about public business, you convert that social gathering into a public meeting. So again, I encourage you in those scenarios to avoid talking about the agenda and the business of the board. Phone calls to the board chair could be a public meeting. If it's just logistics, talking about how, well, I'm going to have to miss part of the meeting. Can we move some of these agenda items earlier for when I will be present? That's not really a public meeting. But if it's, gee, what do you think about that lease proposal? That converts it into a public meeting. Same rules of engagement with communications between other board members that aren't the chair or emails. If, logistics, social things, those are not public meetings, but as soon as you start talking about public business, you've converted it into a public meeting. Your phone calls with the director are typically not going to be a public meeting between one commissioner and a director because it's not a meeting of two commissioners. However, if what is happening is commissioners are trying to communicate to each other through the director, then the director sort of becomes like email or a telephone, and that quickly can become a meeting as well. So just something to keep in mind in your discussions. And the same rules of engagement are when you call or email me, that's not a public meeting until you are asking me to go to another commissioner and figure out what they think about something. All right, executive sessions are very limited, and they're under a number of procedural and substantive constraints. Again, the idea is decision-making is made in front of the public, and the public gets to hear the reasons for the board's making its decision. So some of the substantive constraints are that they're only available for a couple of different items. For the Land Board, primarily it's attorney-client communications and to discuss potential real estate transactions, but not to discuss them in full and not to decide whether to approve them or not, but only to discuss those issues that if you prematurely disclose them, the other side of a negotiation might have an unfair advantage. The example I like to use is I once read a book about Ulysses S. Grant, who was a big fan of horses, and he wanted to buy a horse. His father told him he could buy the horse. He could spend up to $25, but he thought the horse was only worth 10, and that's what he should buy him for. Ulysses S. Grant went over to the ranch, talked to the horse seller, and said, "My dad says I should buy this horse for $10, but that I can't spend more than $25. And the transaction was done for $25. And so it's that type of information that you don't want the other side to know. And critically, no formal action is allowed to be taken in executive session. And that's one of the reasons we go through the dance before and after executive session to be very clear about what we're doing and that we haven't made decisions. There are some procedural constraints, and again, we pretty much take care of that on your end, but just for background for you to know, we need a vote for the Land Board, 4 commissioners to go into executive session. That's why if for some reason we only have 3 commissioners attending, we cannot have an executive session. We're required to record the discussion and maintain that for at least 90 days. And then we're required to announce the topic and the legal basis for the executive session. And again, that's part of the introductory and conclusion of executive session that we go through every time to make sure we check those boxes. And we're not allowed to deviate from those topics that we've announced. A very important part of public meetings is making the record. Again, staff does a great job of providing material in the board's packets and its presentations to provide you with the information you need to make a decision and to build a significant part of the record. And also public comments and public submissions help build the record as well. On your side, what's really important is the discussions and deliberations you have, which is highlighting some of the information that's been provided for you, why you're making a decision, what's persuasive to you, and why you think it's in the best interest of the trust. And those decisions are critical for a number of reasons. One, it allows the public to understand why you're making a decision. If somebody challenges your decision, and this is what I care about, or at least where I come into play, it allows me to explain your decision to a court and a court to understand your decision. And finally, it allows staff to understand the outlook of the board so it can consider things that it needs to be presenting to the board to help the board make a decision. And that's why reasons for your decision are important to be discussed, even if you're voting against an item, an agenda item, because it helps, again, build that record, and it also helps guide staff in the future. All right, moving on to open records, or the CORA, it's often called, for Colorado Open Records Act. Again, this is a transparency issue for good government, and a lot of it turns on definitions. So public records are open for disclosure and review by the public, and so a critical element is what is a public record. And really, the takeaway I'd like for you to have, there's lots of nuances here, but if you're doing anything in writing that's related to the Land Board, you should assume that that is a public record for the Land Board or any of your other agencies that you might be working with. It includes any emails, and I think everybody understands that. Emails aren't that new anymore, but people are still surprised that their emails are included and available for disclosure. So includes emails, public business or board business to any public employee is going to be a public record. Your personal emails in your personal account are private records. They're not subject to disclosure. However, the critical element is the content. If you're using your personal account to email board business, those personal emails or those emails in your personal account are going to be public records. And then board business emails to anyone, whether they're a public employee or not, are also a public record. So we've tried to establish some best practices, particularly around emails, to help you. One, you're provided with a state email address to conduct board business on, and we really encourage you to use those. It helps us prevent your private emails from being searched in a Cora request. It makes it easier for staff to find documents that are responsive to a Cora request. And so encourage that. Remember to treat all your emails, your business emails, as if they might show up in the Denver Post tomorrow. And I guarantee you, if they do, they will not be viewed favorably. So, and then with all your communications with your attorneys, treat them confidentially, whether they're by email, whether they're in executive session, and primarily that means don't share them with others outside of that privileged communication, because that waives the privilege. I don't think you guys will ever receive a Cora request individually about the land board, but should you, please notify Barb and Alicia immediately. There are strict timeframes for responding, and we'd want to get on top of that. And finally, staff and your attorneys are here to help you. We're from the government, so naturally we're here to help. So please reach out to us when you have any questions at all. You know, ounce of prevention, pound of cure, all of that. It's a lot easier to help guide through, to navigate on the front end than to try to figure out and repair the boat on the back end. So please don't hesitate to contact me about any of these questions, or frankly, anything else that I can help with, or staff. We're all here to help you. And that wraps up my portion of our discussion.
Thanks, Ed. Good refresher. Appreciate that.
Sure. Back on. Yep. So commissioners, let me bring it all home with a quick review of the things that staff does to keep all of this stuff organized. Staff does a regular review and makes updates to policy based on the needs and the effectiveness of those policies. We even keep an eye on how often we have to come to the board to talk about something that isn't addressed in policy. Staff is actively engaged in lawmaking as affects the State Land Board. Proposed bills are reviewed by staff for impact to the operations and the fiscal impact as it pertains to the State Land Board. Staff provides workshops, written materials, presentations, and discussion with staff and other subject matter experts on the work of the board. And we make sure to remind the board in all staff requests of the basis for that request in law and strategic plan and policy. And we always ask the board for permission to act in the interest of the trusts. So I don't want anybody to try to read all of that, but these are the board best practices from that piece of statute that I mentioned at the beginning. And they're included in your packet as Exhibit 1 to this information item. I just wanted to give commissioners a chance that when you look this over in reviewing your board packet or even now, I just want to make sure you have an opportunity to let us know that maybe there are some aspects there that we could give additional attention to as staff. Or if you think things are going great, that's great too. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain questions, and Ed is still here to discuss Cora and open records. Open meetings.
Any suggestions or thoughts for Nick related to questions you have or ways that staff can help you more effectively? Yeah, I feel good.
Good. Well, I feel good too. I appreciate the time, commissioners. Thank you.
We all feel good. Yeah. No. Commissioner Carney?
Just for the record on the conflicts of interest deal, the Adobe Creek Ranch, which is the Spady Ranch, which is has state land associated with it. A firm that I'm associated with has that listed. It's not my listing, but they have it listed, so I just wanted to make that for the record.
Okay. Do you have a financial interest in?
No, Bill just thought I needed to mention it.
Benefits?
I just under the heading of transparency, Commissioner Carney is also a realtor. It's a ranch that we've pursued previously. They've changed real estate firms. It's now with the firm that he's associated with. And I just wanted to make sure that there was nobody out in the community who thought that we were doing anything that was not transparent or above board. So, Commissioner Carney, I appreciate you mentioning that and making sure that we're able to clear up any, head off any misconceptions. So, thank you.
Yep.
And I might ask, like, if that does come to us, do you have any initial guidance as to Commissioner Carney's participation? Or is that us?
You know, I probably want to know a few more details before, and I don't want to give you
okay.
a legal thought off the cuff too much, but we can certainly help navigate that.
Okay. All right. Commissioner Heath?
So Ed, how does the Sunshine Law Act, if we were to contact a legislator or someone in the executive branch regarding business that might eventually come before them relating to the land board?
That's a great question. It is, it's technically not going to be a public meeting because it's not a meeting within the agency, the land board. The legislators have their own rules of engagement under public meetings law, and they have a much greater latitude to meet with constituents of all walks of life without it becoming a public meeting. So in most cases, I do not think that's going to be a public meeting. If it's going to come before the board, it has the potential, depending on the person you're talking with, to be what's called an ex parte communication. So if the board's the decision maker and somebody is basically lobbying you on the outside, that has the potential to create some issues. And we've tried to address that concept in the governance manual and the bylaws, but briefly, you are welcome to talk to various constituencies, but it's helpful to remind them that you don't make a decision on your own, that none of the commissioners make a decision by themselves, and that all decisions are made collectively at the board meeting, and that they should bring their concerns to the whole board so the whole board consider it. But that doesn't mean you have to, you know, stiff arm them and say you can't talk to them. It's perfectly appropriate for you to have conversations with folks, but just be mindful of what you think is a very casual conversation. They might take a lot more seriously and try to view it as a binding conversation. So it's helpful to explicitly set out those ground rules.
Ed, is there a determination on texts?
On text?
Yeah.
Texts are going to be there. A text is going to be both a public record and a public meeting. Basically, your medium doesn't matter.
Yeah.
What matters is what the conversation is. If it's about public business, or in our case, if it's about the land board business, however you have it, it's going to be a meeting.
Yeah.
And if it's in writing, it's going to be a public record. So again, it makes life a lot easier if you are not having text conversations, because those are hard to track down when we're responding to a Quora request, and they are hard, to capture from a public meeting context.
Yeah, you might want to add that to your presentation.
Okay.
Just because it's a common, it's used as much as email is nowadays. So.
No, you're right, and that's a great point. And again, whatever your medium is, start from the concept that it's going to be a public record and it's going to be a public meeting.
Yeah.
And then when you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
Nick. Anything else?
That's it from us. Thanks, Commissioner.
You threatened a quiz. You threatened a question. Was that to keep us engaged?
No, the question was, now that you read all this dense material, how are we doing?
I thought you were
answered
going to
it the
ask
right
me
way.
what series was commercial real estate. 600.
There you go. Bonus points. Thanks.
All right. Director Ryan, really quick, we reviewed the 2021 dates, and Commissioner Scanlon just mentioned she might have a conflict in March, but it's TBD. But otherwise, we can stay the course.
It was my March 2020 vacation that got moved to March 2021. So we'll just see how things work.
You're on mute, Bill. You're on mute, Bill. There you go.
You can Zoom from the beach.
Ian, do you want
Good point. Good point.
two different things?
All right. Anything else for the good of the cause? Barb, Tracy, Kim, as always, thank you
Yes.
for what you do to get us prepared and to make this run smoothly. Really appreciate it.
Thanks also.
Always.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Call us adjourned.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Take care.